In 1996, a briefcase washed up on the banks of the Crowan River. It was half buried in roots and river silt, the leather worn down to pulp. Most folks figured it was trash until the boys who found it pried it open and caught a name. Evelyn Marks, attorney at law. A name the city hadn't said out loud in years. But for me, the moment I saw that file land on my desk, I knew we'd been wrong to let it fade. And that briefcase, it hadn't just come loose from the past. It had been waiting. Before we began, TAP subscribed to help uncover stories they tried to bury and make sure no name stays forgotten. My name's Natalie Reyes. I was 38 at the time, newly transferred to the Hudson County Sheriff's Office. I'd spent the last few years in Albany, violent crimes mostly. High volume, low closure. I wasn't running from anything, just ready for quieter work. Hudson was supposed to be that. A slower pace. Cold cases stacked in faded boxes, no one in a rush. I rented a small upstairs unit above a closed photo studio. Ate lunch at the same corner diner 4 days a week. I called my sister every Sunday. Nothing fancy, just order. And I liked it that way. Back then I didn't know the name Evelyn Marks. The call came in just after lunch. A sheriff's deputy had logged a briefcase found by the Crowan River, mud-caked, degraded contents uncertain. A group of middle school boys had pulled it out of a thicket along the low bank. Most of what was inside had fused into one soggy mass, but one thing survived, a laminated bar ID, half-rotted but legible. The name stuck with me. Evelyn Marks. She was listed as a missing person filed back in June of '96. 36 years old. Defense attorney. Last seen near the Bear Mountain Bridge. Her car was found early one morning, door ajar, jacket on the front seat. No purse, no phone, no note. After a week of dragging the river, they stopped looking. The file was marked, no foul play suspected. That was the end of it. Until now. I pulled the original case folder the next day. It was almost empty. A 3-page summary. No scene photos, no witness interviews, no forensics. Someone had signed off on it like she was just another burnout. I asked around at the precinct that morning, mostly out of curiosity. A few heads turned when I said the name. Lawyer Wright took on tough cases. Her car on the bridge, weird one. But no one had answers, just shrugged. That night I visited her sister. Laura Marks answered the door like she'd been expecting the knock for years, said it flat. She didn't jump. She wasn't cold about it, just steady, resigned. Evelyn had been cautious, she told me. Paranoid maybe, but not unstable. She locked everything, kept duplicates of her files, didn't take chances. 2 days before she vanished, she called a locksmith to fix the hinge on her safe. Wouldn't say why, but what she did say stuck with Laura. If anything happens to me, don't believe what they say. I wrote that line down and underlined it, twice. Laura handed me a taped-up shoebox. Inside were scraps, a receipt from the locksmith, a set of backup keys, a photo of Evelyn in a maroon trench coat. Nothing pointed, nothing definitive, but it felt like a breadcrumb trail meant to outlast her. The next morning, I filed a formal review request on the case. Nothing dramatic, just flagged it for secondary evaluation. But already, something about it felt heavy, like the kind of weight you don't feel all at once. Later that week, I was digging through court records from Evelyn's final year. Dozens of cases, most of them routine. But one file caught my attention. Thicker than the rest, flagged in red ink. People v. Marcus Brandt. That name meant nothing to me yet, but I would come to learn it meant everything to her. And by the time I did, it would already be too late to undo what had been done. I didn't know what I expected to find when I pulled the case log for People v. Marcus Brandt. But the moment I opened the folder, I could feel the weight of it. 16 pages thick, flagged at the edges like someone had wanted it remembered. Evelyn had taken the case pro bono. Marcus was 17 at the time, charged with robbery and the murder of an off-duty cop named Glenn Turney. According to the report, he'd been arrested less than an hour after the crime. Blood on his sweatshirt. A discarded .38 recovered from a nearby dumpster. The story read clean. Too clean. But Evelyn hadn't thought so. She'd challenged the chain of custody, filed motions to suppress the weapon, demanded to see the arresting officer's discipline records. It was all logged plain as day. Then, 3 days before jury selection, she vanished. The trial collapsed. Marcus was handed a public defender and took a plea. I circled 2 names on the arrest summary, Detective Ray Duca and Detective Carter Humes. Then I cross-checked them against the precinct's incident log for that year. Their names came up over and over again. Different defendants, different dates, same language. Tip from unnamed witness. Gun found in nearby alley. Foot pursuit. I'd seen patterns like that before, stories too consistent to be true. I left early the next morning and made the drive upstate to Clinton Correctional. It was the kind of facility built for visibility from a distance, not transparency inside. Gray walls, square towers, wings that didn't allow sound to carry. Marcus was in his mid-30s now, lean, calm, and quiet. He didn't speak right away, just watched me as I sat down across the table. The guard gave us 10 minutes. I told him who I was, why I was reopening Evelyn's case. He exhaled, leaned back, and said, "Nobody said that name to me in 10 years. I asked if he remembered the last time he saw her. He nodded. Week before trial. 4-5 days out. She said the case was rotten, that it wasn't just me. She said there were cops involved, more than one, and if she could break it open, she'd take them down with it. I asked if she ever said names. He shook his head. No. She was careful, but she meant it. His voice stayed even, but there was something in his face that shifted when he said it. She was the only person who looked at me like I mattered. The guard stepped back in to signal time. I stood to leave, but he stopped me with one more line. They got to her before she could act. I didn't say anything. I just nodded and walked out. Back at my desk, I pulled the visitor log from the week Marcus had mentioned. No record of Evelyn entering Clinton. No video files survived from that year either. Not that they would have kept them that long. I submitted a verification request to the warden's office anyway, but I already knew what they'd say. No visit, no record, nothing unusual. The absence felt deliberate. I went back through the court transcripts. Evelyn had filed motions, but they weren't attached to the file. No hearing was held. The judge noted her absence in passing, but didn't ask why her documentation wasn't there. There was no delay requested, no inquiry. The case just moved on. I started pulling other cases tied to Duca and Humes. People v. Donnelly, 1995. People v. Jariah, same year. The narratives were nearly identical. Anonymous tip. Gun found in alley. Unnamed witness gone before trial. The rhythm was too precise to be coincidence. I locked the files in my cabinet and filled out an internal affairs records request on both men. Triple copy, one for me, one for review, one for the drawer no one ever opens. I handed it off to a liaison who didn't even look up when he said it could take weeks. I didn't correct him. I just left. My rental was quiet that night. I didn't expect updates from forensics, not yet. I checked the mailbox out of habit. Inside was a plain manila envelope, no return address, no postmark. I opened it on the counter. A single photo slid out. Grainy, faded from an old courthouse security camera. Evelyn standing in a hallway, facing a woman I didn't recognize. Clerk uniform, dark bun, mid-30s. On the back, someone had written in blue ink, Torres, 42nd Precinct. I cross-referenced it against internal staff logs from 1996. Only one match came up, Alina Taos, civilian employee, resigned in early 97. No record since, no forwarding address. I kept digging. DMV files, state licensing boards. One name change request buried in a neighboring county. Alina Marquez. The address was linked to a small elder care facility outside Binghamton. I drove down the next morning. Quiet place, short-staffed. I checked in under a false pretext and asked around, found her folding towels beside a resident in a back corner lounge. She looked older than I expected, thinner too. I approached carefully, didn't flash the badge. Just told her my name and that I was looking into Evelyn Marks's disappearance. She froze, then quietly said, "You shouldn't have come here." I showed her the photo. She stared at it, then looked away. "She scared them," she said. "That's the truth." I asked what she meant. She said a few days before Evelyn disappeared, she came in with an envelope. Said it needed to reach the commander's inbox. She was nervous, focused. Alina said she asked about it the next day, but the envelope was never logged. Then she paused. Said she'd overheard something one night passing the break room Duca saying if she's gotta go, she's gotta go. Humes had laughed. She didn't stop walking. Just kept going, put in her resignation that same week. Changed her name. Didn't look back. Before I left, I asked if she remembered the name Luis Rojas. Her face tightened. "He was in holding," she said. "I remember because his name came over dispatch twice. Evelyn said he was helping her. A CI. He vanished 2 days before she did. Just gone. No transfer sheet. No discharge form. I asked if she thought it was connected. "I think it's all connected," she said. I didn't drive straight back. Stopped at a gas station, filled the tank, then sat at a diner just off the highway and opened my notes. Names, dates, motions filed, motions ignored. People who vanished, people who signed off on empty files. When I finally pulled into the alley behind my rental, I knew something was off before I even stepped out. My passenger side tire was low, rear tire flat. Not punctured, sliced, clean, careful. I crouched down and checked the tread. Didn't need a lab tech to tell me what it meant. Someone had been close. Close enough to send a message. I didn't sleep that night. I rerouted everything back to the briefcase. It wasn't a piece of debris anymore. It was a crime scene. I called a contact at the regional crime lab. Told him I needed a secondary sweep priority handling. He hesitated until I used the phrase, possible officer-involved homicide. After that, things moved fast. 3 hours later, I stood in the chilled lab while 2 forensic techs worked under bright task lights. "It's degraded," one of them said, turning the briefcase gently. "But we can still try the seams." They swabbed the zipper teeth, used protein markers, fine-tipped brushes. They worked in silence. Careful. An hour passed. Then one of them called out, "You're gonna want to see this." They'd pulled a trace-dried epithelial cells caught under the zipper. Not much, but enough. Enough to build a profile. The call came the next day just after noon. Match confirmed. Carter Humes. And that changed everything. When I knocked on Humes's door, I half expected him not to answer. But he did, tired, unshaven, standing there in a thermal shirt with the porch light behind him. I told him who I was, held out my badge, and he didn't flinch. He didn't invite me in either, just stepped aside and left the door open. His living room was bare. One recliner, a scuffed coffee table, an old bookshelf with nothing on it but dust. No TV, no family photos. He sat down slowly, elbows on his knees. I didn't move from the door. "That case is 12 years old," he said. I told him that's what surprised me. His DNA had turned up on Evelyn Marks's briefcase. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. He sat still for a long moment, then looked down at his hands. "I didn't kill her," he said. I told him I was listening. Whatever happened next, he needed to be clear. He said it started as pressure, nothing direct, just murmurs. Evelyn had been filing complaints, drawing too much attention. She said she had something. Evidence. Enough to bring people down. Ray just wanted to scare her, he said. That was the plan. He waited for her in a parking lot the night she disappeared, told her to back off, said she wouldn't. She swung her briefcase at him, hit him in the face. He shoved her, knocked her out, drove off in her car. She came to near the bridge. Things got worse. She tried to run. He panicked, said he called Duca, told him it got out of hand. Ray said to bring her to him, he said. She was still alive when I left. I asked where. He hesitated, then gave a location, a cabin north of Route 301, old narcotics stash house long abandoned. You'll need dogs, he said. It's not on the maps. I asked if he had keys. He shook his head. Didn't need them. I arrested him for obstruction and accessory to murder. He didn't fight it. Didn't say another word as I cuffed him and walked him out. He was processed at a regional holding center just before midnight. No press, no noise. Just a quiet intake on a quiet charge that should have been louder. I called the DA's office and requested a full forensic sweep on the cabin site. A warrant team was already packing gear before I hung up. I drove home, filed my notes, and didn't sleep. The call came at 7:14 the next morning. Albany desk sergeant. Humes was dead, found hanging in his cell, torn bedsheet tied to a ceiling vent. Suicide, they said. I asked if he was in isolation. He was. I asked if anyone on shift had ties to the 42nd precinct. The line went quiet. I didn't push. I already knew. The trail off Route 301 was nearly gone. Overgrowth so thick we had to cut through with machetes. The air felt pressed in. Not humid, just dense, like the woods had learned how to keep secrets. The cabin sat on a slope swallowed halfway by brush and rot. No signage, no marker, just a lean-to roof and rusted siding. Duca hadn't picked this place at random. He knew it would vanish. The dogs moved first circling, then freezing halfway down the hill behind the structure. One of them barked sharp and low nose locked on a patch of earth beneath a cluster of ferns. The handler marked the spot, and the recovery team stepped in. They worked slow, cut back the growth, flagged the grid, and started to dig. I stayed back near the tree line. Didn't say much. Didn't have to. After about 2 hours, one of the techs called out. "We have textile." I moved closer. A maroon sleeve, tattered, dirt-fused, still visible under the light. Ribs, partial spine. One wrist bent inward, fractured. A broken watch. The coat matched what Laura said Evelyn wore that day. Deep red, almost black from time and soil. The body had been buried shallow, wrapped in brush, left to vanish. But she hadn't gone easily. Defensive fractures on the ulna. Fingernails, cracked tissue embedded underneath. Dr. Ellman confirmed what I already knew. Evelyn had fought back, and the DNA under her nails confirmed who she'd fought. Ray Duca. I didn't call it in right away. Not until the lab results were in my hand. I typed the warrant request myself line by line, then added a sealed indictment request. No press, no leaks. The DA signed off that evening. We kept the task force small. 5 names. 2 from internal affairs. 1 federal marshal, 1 tech from my old unit in Syracuse, and a sergeant I trusted with my life. We met in a back conference room at 7:30. Doors locked. I laid out the plan. Quiet entry. No warnings. No mistakes. I told them Duca knew the system. He'd built his armor inside it. But we had the cracks now. By morning he was gone. A detective from 1st Precinct called as I was on my way to brief the marshals. Duca had left his house before dawn. He wasn't alone. 2 others with him, both former officers. 1 retired narcotics, 1 on leave since a use of force complaint last year. Names matched up with old IA notes. Eric Ball and Vince Rouleau. They'd shown up before. Unofficial surveillance. Witness intimidation. Quiet payoffs. I had footage within the hour. SUV pulling out of Duca's driveway. Heading north. The alert went out to border control. It wasn't a manhunt yet, but it was moving that way. The vehicle pinged on a license plate reader just south of Plattsburgh. I flew into Burlington and crossed back over to coordinate the intercept. The customs agent who flagged them kept his voice low, said they'd pulled off into a wooded turnout just short of the checkpoint. We moved in with restraint, weapons holstered, voices clear. Ball and Rouleau stepped out first, palms open. Duca followed slowly like he'd already made peace with it. No fight, no words. He glanced once at my badge, then looked away. I told him it was over. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. In the back seat on the ride down, I flipped through the second folder I'd brought with me. Not for him, just to have it close. Evelyn's affidavit. The lab reports, a log of every misconduct complaint filed against Duca since 1995. I laid them out in order. Let the silence do its work. He didn't ask what I had, but I could feel him watching the pages. We booked him late that evening. He sat in interrogation like he was waiting for a dentist, not a murder charge. Calm, loose. I laid out the tape recorder between us. Pressed play. Evelyn's voice came through faint but clear. If I disappear, it was them. She named him. She named Humes. She mentioned a CI. She said they forged evidence. Duca didn't flinch. That's your proof, he said. A whisper on a cassette I didn't answer. I opened the folder and slid a copy of Evelyn's signed statement across the table. We found the second tape I said, the one she left with her sister, along with typed affidavits, forensic matches, a full list of names. She gave us everything. Duca didn't touch the paper, but he didn't look away either. I told him the charges: first-degree murder, obstruction, evidence tampering, conspiracy. 2 officers stepped into the room. One released his cuffs from the table, the other locked them behind his back. Duca stood without a word. As they walked him out, I stayed seated, my hands flat on the table, the recorder still between them. Evelyn's voice had faded back into static, but it was there. It had always been there. We'd just stopped listening. The night after Duca was arrested, I stayed late at the precinct, going over everything again. Evelyn's motions, the suppressed witness statements, the threadbare notes buried in her file. Even with the confession and the lab results, something still didn't feel settled. There were too many absences, too many silences that didn't line up. I'd worked enough cases to know that once people start talking, others start disappearing. I tried to get some sleep that night, but I couldn't quiet my mind. Not because of what we'd found, because of what we hadn't. Somewhere in the middle of those hours, I wrote out every name I could remember from the files I'd pulled. Cases Evelyn had worked. Officers she had crossed. Judges who let too much pass without comment. It didn't give me peace, but it gave me something to hold on to. The next few days blurred. Paperwork stacked up. Meetings I barely heard. I stayed quiet through all of it, working late in the back office, filing reports that I knew no one would read carefully. I kept to myself mostly. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. Once a case starts to tighten around cops, people get nervous. Conversations in the hallway would stop when I walked past. Eyes dropped. Phones hung up quickly. Even the ones I trusted grew quiet. It wasn't hostility, it was distance. Like people were waiting to see if I'd keep going or burn out trying. Every night I went home to that old upstairs rental. The one above the shuttered photo studio. My tires had been replaced. No one had tried anything since. But I still checked the locks 3 times before bed. Just habit now. I kept the case files stacked in piles around the apartment on the floor, on the counter, even at the foot of the bed. I didn't tell anyone how often I reread them. How I marked each repeat phrase, each identical line of testimony that showed up across different arrests. It was the kind of work that didn't feel like progress while you were doing it. Just repetition. Obsession, maybe. But I couldn't let it go. Not when I could still hear Evelyn's voice on that cassette naming people who were still walking free. Some nights I'd sit in the dark and listen to the tape again. Not just the part where she named Duca and Humes. All of it. The silences, the stops and starts, the places where her voice shook then steadied. She hadn't just recorded evidence. She'd recorded fear. Not panic, just certainty. She knew what was coming, and she left the trail anyway. I tried to get updated court records from her final cases, but most of the motion files were missing, lost or sealed. Some had been scanned incompletely with pages blacked out for confidential reasons. When I followed up with the court clerk's office, I got voicemail. When I showed up in person, I got polite shrugs and misfiled folders. That kind of resistance doesn't come from laziness. It comes from someone making sure the wrong drawer stays closed. Eventually, I got access to one of the older storage rooms in the basement archive. Paper files mostly, stamped and brittle. I pulled every criminal case Evelyn had touched in her final year. Not just Marcus Brant's. All of them. I laid them out by date, then by arresting officer. Duca and Humes showed up more than anyone. But so did 3 others. Officers I didn't recognize immediately frisk Bal Rouleau. Their names had stayed just under the surface, not in the headlines, not on any formal reprimand logs, but they were there always just behind the action, assisting with arrests, filing addendums, sitting in court when no one else was looking. The deeper I went, the clearer the pattern became. Evidence submitted with no chain of custody. Witnesses who changed statements mid-process. Charges upgraded after someone got transferred. Evelyn had been circling all of it. Quietly. Carefully. And if I was right, she'd been using a confidential informant to help her put it together, Rojas. The same man Alina mentioned. The one who disappeared 2 days before Evelyn did. I went back through old dispatch logs from 1996. Not digital paper scans. Hard to read. Not indexed. I had to search line by line. Took hours. But I found his name. Luis Rojas. Holding, 42nd Precinct. Cleared for release. No signature. No transfer note. Just a stamp that read, processed. Nothing after that. No court date. No follow-up report. He vanished before he could testify to anything. There was a moment around 2 in the morning where I caught myself standing in the middle of the room just staring at the same form I'd already read 4 times. Not reading anymore, just trying to feel what she must have felt. Knowing she had something. Knowing it wouldn't be enough if the right people stayed quiet. That's what sat with me the most. Not what they did to her. What they let die with her. The next day I called Laura. I hadn't spoken to her since the day we found Evelyn. I asked if I could stop by. She didn't ask why. Just told me to come. When I arrived, she had already cleared the coffee table. No music, no TV, just silence. I sat across from her and asked if she remembered Evelyn mentioning other names. People who came by late. Phone calls she didn't take in front of others. Laura shook her head slow. She kept everything close, she said. Told me once that it was safer if I didn't know. I asked if Evelyn ever sent anything through the mail. Left anything in a safety deposit box. Laura paused, then went to the back of the house. Came back with a worn envelope taped along one side. I found this after the funeral, she said. Didn't know what to do with it. Inside was a photocopy of a typed memo. Not signed, not dated. Just one line at the bottom in handwriting I recognized from Evelyn's motions. If you're reading this, I didn't walk off that bridge. I took it with me, sealed it into an evidence sleeve, and didn't speak for the rest of the drive back. Not because I didn't know what it meant, but because I already did. The next morning, I went in early before the noise of the day could find its way into the corners of the precinct. I spread the documents from Laura's envelope out on my desk, the pale light coming through the blinds turning everything the color of old linen. The handwriting at the bottom of Evelyn's memo drew my eye again and again. I found myself tracing each word with my fingertip as if I could feel the urgency she must have felt when she wrote it. I read through the old motions, the ones Evelyn had filed in Marcus Brandt's case and others. Most were routine procedural until I came across a scanned page buried near the back of one folder. The page looked different from the others. The ink was faded, but it was stamped as received by the DA's office 1 week before Evelyn vanished. In the margin was a tiny, almost careless note copy sent to IA. I checked the log for any record of that copy reaching Internal Affairs, but there was nothing. No entry. No response. It should have been just another overlooked detail, but it stuck with me. I started combing through all the chain of custody logs I could access for that spring. Most were blank, missing signatures or hastily initialed. A few pages in, I noticed a recurring set of initials, R.D. and C.H. Ray Duca and Carter Humes signed for evidence in half a dozen cases where they'd also been the primary arresting officers. I knew it wasn't supposed to work that way. The same hands making arrests, moving the evidence, and then writing the report. The more I looked, the more I saw those initials popping up at critical points when evidence was lost, when witnesses withdrew, when statements were altered. It was as if there was an invisible tether connecting each of these cases, each one tightening around Evelyn as she got closer to whatever she was building. After lunch, I drove back out to the crime lab. The technician who'd run the DNA match on the briefcase was still on shift. She remembered my name. I asked her if she'd had a chance to review any old forensics fingerprints, fibers, anything that might have survived from Evelyn's car or office. She shook her head, but suggested she could run a secondary sweep on the briefcase, focusing on the seams and inner lining where older particulates might have been trapped. The lab wasn't busy. She suited up and brought the case to a table under the task lights. I stood by watching as she worked a fine-tipped brush around the zipper, picking up fragments barely visible to the eye. It took a while, but then she paused, using a swab to lift a stubborn fleck caught beneath a corner of the metal hinge. She didn't say anything at first, just labeled the sample, logged it, and moved on. As she finished, she handed me the evidence bag. "It's worth a try," she said quietly. "You never know what'll last." I drove back into town thinking about how many things in this case had been handed off in quiet, tired gestures. One more envelope, one more file. The briefcase had survived years in the mud, and still something inside might have outlasted all the rest. I kept running through Evelyn's words, the warnings she gave her sister, the way she'd locked down her office and asked about the courier service that last night. It was as if she'd known the only thing that could outlive her was the paper trail she left behind. That afternoon, I requested access to the storage unit where Evelyn's seized property had been kept. It was a formality, but the clerk at evidence seemed distracted, barely looking at my credentials as he buzzed me through. The room was a vault, cinder block walls, no windows, the kind of place meant to make people forget about what's inside. I found the box labeled with her name, same battered handwriting as before. The only things inside were DMV records, a bar application photo, and tucked at the bottom a folded water-damaged receipt from a locksmith. The date was 2 days before Evelyn disappeared. I called the number listed, half expecting it to be out of service, but an older man answered. I asked if he remembered the call to Evelyn's house that week. He was quiet a moment, then said, "Yeah, I remember." She was nervous. Told me not to talk to anyone about the safe. I asked if she'd mentioned being threatened. He paused. Didn't say it out loud, but she kept looking at the door. I wrote his words down and thanked him. Back in my car, I stared at the courthouse across the street. I kept thinking about the briefcase, the way those boys had found it by accident after all those years. It hadn't floated downstream from the bridge, at least not in any way that made sense, given where her car was found and where the river bends. The more I looked at the old maps, the more I realized it had to have been thrown from the north bank at a spot where the current was slow and the embankment hard to reach by foot. The only access was a gravel maintenance road locked most of the year. According to county records, the only people with keys were city works and the police. I made a note to request surveillance logs if any even survived. Later that night, I was back at my kitchen table piecing together every oddity I could find. The initials in the evidence logs, the briefcase's improbable journey, the receipt Evelyn kept in her safe. It didn't add up to the whole answer, but it shifted something. I no longer believed Evelyn had just been unlucky. She had known she was being watched. She had known which hands were moving the pieces. And now, with the DNA sample from the briefcase running at the lab, I felt like I was finally standing on the edge of the next layer. The phone rang just after midnight. It was the technician. "We got a partial result," she said. "You're going to want to see this." I listened to her footsteps on the linoleum, the hum of the lab's old refrigerator in the background. "It's not a lot," she said, "but we have enough to confirm trace epithelial cells with a viable nucleus. It matches Hume's, not just from his job, but from direct contact recent to the time of the disappearance." I thanked her and hung up. I sat in the dark for a long time, the phone still in my hand, the briefcase closed on the table. The story had never been just about what was lost. It was about what was left behind and who was still willing to see it. In that moment, I realized Evelyn had managed, even if just by inches, to point the way forward. The chain was starting to unravel. I spent most of the night at my kitchen table going over every step that had brought me to this point. The partial DNA match from the briefcase wasn't a full confession, but it was enough to make the silence in the house feel heavier than usual. Every small noise, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, even the shift of the old chair beneath me felt sharper, more deliberate. I found myself checking the lock on the back door a fourth time before finally heading to bed. Even then, I lay awake with the ceiling lit by passing headlights, thinking about Hume's name coming up in that lab report and the way the past seemed to keep pushing back. In the morning, I drove to Albany and requested to speak with Hume's again, but the intake desk told me he'd already been moved to a different holding cell, the paperwork still in process. It was a phrase I'd heard too many times. I sat in my car in the parking lot watching the sun edge its way over the row of unmarked cruisers and called in a favor to the regional DA's office asking for temporary access to any unsealed files related to narcotics or off-the-books operations in the area around Route 301. The assistant DA didn't sound thrilled, but she promised to send over what she could. By mid-afternoon, a thick envelope arrived at my desk. Most of it was bureaucratic boilerplate reports, log sheets for seized vehicles, site inventories, a list of decommissioned cabins used for undercover work. One address, penciled in the margin of a scan, caught my eye. North Woods, 301E, not on map. Ask Bal. I called the number for the property office and got a voicemail. I left a message, then checked out a county vehicle and made the drive upstate. The woods along Route 301 were thick and quiet, the kind of dense growth that closes in on you as soon as you step away from the shoulder. I pulled over by a faded gate and walked half a mile down a rutted maintenance trail, the last 100 feet barely visible. My boots sank into moss and leaf litter, the air cold enough to sting at the back of my throat. The old narcotics cabin looked worse than I expected. Roof caving and one window shattered siding warped with moisture. But someone had been here since it was abandoned. There were boot prints in the mud fresher than the rain from 2 days before. I waited by the door, breathing in the smell of wet bark and something else, sharp and chemical like old cleaning solution. I stepped inside, flashlight sweeping the corners. The living room was stripped bare, just a broken chair and a metal filing cabinet on its side. In the back bedroom, a discarded piece of cloth caught on a nail in the wall, faded burgundy. I took photos, bagged it, and kept moving. I was about to leave when I noticed a faint line carved into the baseboard behind where the bed would have been. I knelt and pried at it with my pocket knife. A hidden compartment. Inside a single cassette tape, warped but intact, wrapped in wax paper. My gloves made it awkward, but I could see the handwriting, EM black marker, nearly erased by moisture. I pocketed the tape and headed back to the car, glancing over my shoulder more than once. There were no cars in the gravel pull-off, but the hair on the back of my neck stayed up the whole drive home. At the lab the next morning, the forensic techs worked in silence, cataloging every scrap and splinter I'd collected. The cloth was a match for the coat Laura remembered from the day Evelyn vanished. Soil samples pulled from the fabric matched the ground behind the cabin. One of the team members called me over just before lunch holding a sealed evidence bag. Inside were 2 fingernails snapped with slivers of skin still attached. "We'll rush the DNA," she said, nodding. "But you already know, don't you?" I did. I'd known since I saw the name on that memo Evelyn left her sister. If you're reading this, I didn't walk off that bridge. I took the cassette back to my rental, dusted off the old tape player I kept for interviews, and pressed play. The recording was warped static in the background, but Evelyn's voice came through slow, deliberate, exhausted. She talked about cases she couldn't let go, about evidence changing hands before it reached the clerk. She said names Duca Hume's Frisk. She talked about a CI who'd been threatened, then gone. She talked about threats about watching the rearview mirror at night. She said she'd given a sealed complaint to Internal Affairs, a backup copy with her sister, and that she feared the right people would bury both. If something happened, she said, it wouldn't be an accident. "I want it on record," she finished. "I want them to know I didn't give up." I sat for a long time after the tape clicked off, the player humming with empty air. It's one thing to chase a story. It's another to hear the person at the center of it lay out her fears in her own voice, knowing how the story ended. That night, I wrote out a new timeline. I circled every date when evidence was logged by Duca, every moment Evelyn filed a motion or left a message with her sister or the DA. It painted a map of pressure points of where the case had bent, never snapped, just bent until finally she disappeared. Late that night, as rain started tapping against the window, I heard tires rolling slow down the alley behind my building. I flicked off the lamp and watched through the gap in the blinds. An unmarked sedan, windows tinted. It idled for a minute, then pulled away. I waited a long time before turning the light back on. The world had moved on, but this case had drawn me so far in that I couldn't let it go even if I wanted to. The rain held on through the night and into the next day, making the woods behind the narcotics cabin heavy with fog and a chill that settled in your bones. The forensic crew worked slow, careful not to let the mud swallow their evidence before they could tag it. I watched them from the edge of the tree line, hands in my pockets, boots sinking into the mossy earth. The site had been quiet for years, forgotten except by those who knew what to look for. But the dog team was sharp German shepherds trained to catch the faintest scent, and when one of them started barking tail rigid, everyone on the hill went still. They marked a spot behind the cabin, a patch of ground that looked no different than any other, but the dog wouldn't budge. The recovery team moved in, cutting back the brush and scraping away the first layer of wet earth. It took time, and no one said much while they worked. I remember the first piece of fabric they pulled free, a maroon sleeve torn and ground into the soil. Then bone. The shape of a forearm ribs collapsed in. They worked by hand brushes and trowels, patient as surgeons. When the remains were finally exposed, what was left of Evelyn Marks was wrapped in her coat, the same deep wine red Laura had described. A wristwatch, cracked and half buried, was found beside her. The ground had preserved enough that there was no mistaking who she was or how she'd fought. The pathologist's report came back late that evening. Defensive fractures on both arms, a blow to the side of the head, signs of a struggle. Soil embedded under her fingernails. I drove back to the lab, stood in the corridor while the technicians worked a rush order on the DNA, and waited. It was almost dawn before they called me in. Skin cells found under Evelyn's nails. The result was clear Ray Duca. I sat outside the lab, hands on the steering wheel, watching the sun come up through the smear of rain on the windshield. I felt the exhaustion in my shoulders, a weight I couldn't set down. The evidence was finally there, The forensics, the tape, the paper trail Evelyn had left behind. She'd mapped out her own disappearance in cautious notes and muffled warnings in every file she'd locked away. The truth was in front of us, and it was worse than anyone had imagined. The judge who'd let the case close without inquiry. The officers who'd signed for evidence they later lost. The names Evelyn spoke into the recorder in her own flat, steady voice. She'd trusted someone would listen. Someone finally did. Back at the precinct, I typed the warrant request for Duca, making sure every supporting page was there. I signed my name to the indictment recommendation and slid the file across the desk to the DA. There was no ceremony, just the steady shuffle of paper and a nod from the district attorney as he read the last page. The grand jury moved faster than I expected. Too much had built up for anyone to hide behind the old excuses. The task force was ready by morning, small, tight, no room for leaks. When we went to serve the warrant, Duca was already gone. The bolo came through 2 hours later. Vehicle matching his was flagged heading north close to the Canadian border. I drove through the night to Burlington, met with the marshals on the Vermont side, and listened to the radio chatter as they tracked the SUV along the interstate. When they finally stopped him, he stepped out with his hands visible, no fight left in him. His face was blank, eyes steady, like a man who knew the outcome had been written a long time ago. In the interview room, Duca sat across from me, silent as ever. The metal table, the closed door, the tape recorder waiting between us. I played the cassette. Evelyn's voice filled the air, naming him, describing the threats, the evidence, the patterns. He barely moved. I slid a copy of her affidavit across the table, the one with the list of names she'd compiled. He didn't reach for it. I told him we'd matched his DNA, that the grand jury had returned an indictment for murder and conspiracy. He looked down at the folder, jaw set, not defiant, just done. There was no confession, no apology, just the hard, resigned silence of someone who'd run out of places to hide. The rest moved quickly. The DA called a press conference, the room packed, wall-to-wall, lights harsh and voices low. I stood to the side as the charges were read out. Murder, obstruction, evidence, tampering, conspiracy. Humes had already been named posthumously. 3 other officers, Friskball, Rouleau, were indicted for their roles in falsifying evidence and coercing testimony in cases tied to Evelyn's last year. I thought of Marcus Brandt still in prison because a string of signatures and forged reports said he belonged there. I requested his case be reviewed. The DA agreed. For the first time in years, the doors to the courthouse felt less heavy. That night when I finally let myself rest, I sat with the folder open on my lap, reading through Evelyn's words again. She hadn't left just a warning. She'd left a record, a map for anyone willing to follow it, even if it meant losing your way along the path. When the news broke the next morning, I turned off the TV. I'd heard enough. Sometimes the truth doesn't roar. Sometimes it just sits quietly until someone lifts the stone. When the indictments were finally read out, I watched the press conference from the back of the room, arms crossed, shoulder to shoulder with people who just months earlier would have never expected these names to surface. The DA spoke plainly. No dramatics, first-degree murder for Duca conspiracy, and evidence tampering for the others. Carter Humes was named posthumously for obstruction and accessory. There was a tension in the air that felt less like relief and more like something heavy finally breaking loose. A handful of reporters raised their hands, asking about oversight, about how it went so long unnoticed. The DA didn't offer much, neither did I. There's only so much comfort in a list of charges, no matter how long it took to get there. After the conference, I drove upstate to the correctional facility where Marcus Brandt had been serving out a sentence built on lies. The guard who let me in didn't ask questions. Marcus waited for me in the visitation area, posture, rigid eyes, cautious. When I told him his conviction was vacated, that new evidence had cleared his name, he didn't react right away. He just sat there, hands folded, like he was waiting for someone to say it was a mistake. When the guard returned to escort him out, Marcus stood and nodded at me, slow and careful, as if he still couldn't trust the ground under his feet. Outside, the sun was just setting. I handed him a plain envelope bus fare, a phone, a voucher for a hotel room. "There's a legal aid group that wants to help you get set up," I told him. He took the envelope, looking at it for a long moment. "She believed me," he said. His voice was rough. "All this time I thought maybe she gave up." I shook my head. "She never did. Neither did you." There was no public closure for the families of the other cases Evelyn had tried to expose. Some wounds never really close. I watched from the sidelines as 3 more convictions were re-examined, 2 overturned outright, 1 case dropped when evidence was shown to be falsified. A handful of officers resigned before charges could be brought. Others were quietly moved to desk duty. There was no parade, no headline victory, just the slow machinery of justice finally creaking forward after years stuck in the same rut. I called Laura the morning after the indictments. She answered on the second ring, voice thin but steady. "You did it," she said, and there was no triumph in her tone, just a kind of tired gratitude. I met her later that week at the cemetery, the sky gray and low, a chill in the air. Marcus came too. We stood in front of Evelyn's new headstone, the granite still light against the darker stones around it. Laura placed a single white rose at the base. Marcus crouched, pressed his hand to the cool stone, and whispered, "Thank you for giving me my life back." I let them have their silence. When I stepped forward, I pulled from my coat pocket a copy of Evelyn's original complaint, the one that started all of this, the one that nearly vanished. I slid it under a small stone at the grave's edge. It wouldn't last long, but that wasn't the point. It was a way of closing a circle. I drove back to the precinct and filed the last of the paperwork, hands shaking just slightly from exhaustion more than anything else. The story hit the evening news, and people talked for a week or 2. There were calls for policy changes, a task force for reviewing old cases, talk of better safeguards. But most people outside a handful of families went on with their lives. Justice, I've learned, is never as loud as the damage that comes before it. That night back at home, I sat in the dark and played the cassette one last time. Evelyn's voice, steady and certain, filled the room. It sounded less like a warning now, and more like a declaration that the truth was going to be found even if it took years and cost more than it should have. I kept the folder of her handwritten notes in my top drawer. Every now and then I'd reach for them, tracing the ink with my thumb, feeling the weight of all the things she never got to finish. As the days passed, things didn't snap back to normal. There's no real normal after something like this. Some of the people who'd kept their distance before offered nods in the hallway, a quiet good job, or about time. But most just moved around me, returning to their routines, the business of a city that would keep turning whether or not justice ever truly landed. A week after the verdicts, I got a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single page, a photocopy of an old case file, an arrest Evelyn had challenged a year before she disappeared, scrawled at the bottom in blue pen. "There's always more beneath." I tucked it in with the rest. The story wasn't finished, not really. But for the first time in years, it felt like the truth had a place to breathe. There's a kind of quiet that settles over a case once the headlines fade and the files are boxed up. The world keeps moving, new stories, new faces on the evening news, but for the people who lived through it, the echoes last a long time. Even now, when I walk past the old courthouse, I catch myself looking up at the windows, half expecting to see Evelyn's reflection, head bent over a folder, always working, always one step ahead of the dark. Her name is carved into the stone at the cemetery on the edge of town. It's just a name now, but the weight behind it will never really go away. Laura visits most Sundays, a fresh flower in hand, her voice steady, not broken. Marcus is still learning what freedom means after so many years lost, and some days I see him on the bus staring out the window as if searching for a world that matches the one he dreamed of while he waited. As for me, the precinct eventually went back to routine. The stacks of paperwork thinned. The late nights faded into something more manageable. There were days I'd catch a familiar look in the eyes of another detective, one that said, I know what it costs to see something through. And in the quieter moments, I found myself reaching for Evelyn's file, running a thumb along the worn edge of her notes, letting her voice settle the air for just a little while longer. She never gave up, not when it mattered most, and because of that, others got a chance at the truth. But truth comes with a price. You don't get back what's lost time. Trust the easy faith that the world is fair. Justice can be heavy, and the relief is never as clean as you hope. Still, there's something lasting about the way a single determined voice, even one silenced too soon, can keep a door open for the rest of us. Evelyn's story didn't end the way she deserved, but it changed more than I ever expected. There are days I wish I could tell her that. If there's anything this case taught me, it's that memory matters. Even when the world wants to move on, there's a quiet strength in holding on to what's true and standing up for those who aren't here to speak for themselves. You don't have to be loud, you just have to last. Thank you for listening and letting Evelyn's name be remembered. If her story stayed with you, I hope you'll share it or leave a thought below so no one is left behind and no voice is lost to time.